A lot of you have probably seen clips of text-based AIs like Google Bard and ChatGPT drafting legal contracts. It's pretty clear at this point that you can give an AI a command like draft a contract for an actor in an independent film saying that they're going to be paid such and it'll respond with a draft agreement that would probably be a legally binding contract, even if some of it might be a little bit weird and it might not necessarily have all the terms that you would want. There's no question that what AIs can do is very impressive for just being a computer program. I think the question on a lot of people's minds is, can we rely on these AIs to put contracts in final form? That is, in the independent film context, can we rely on an AI to just prepare a contract and then we'll send it off to someone involved in our independent film without the need for a lawyer to look at it? As you'll see in this video, the answer, at least right now in May of 2023, is no. It may be possible someday for an AI to basically do all the tasks that would normally be associated with legal representation, from drafting contracts to negotiating with the other side and so on. But for now, a real-life lawyer is definitely needed to review and probably do a lot of revisions to any kind of contract that's prepared by an AI. Right now, the best use for AI in the legal context is probably as an assistant to a lawyer as opposed to being a lawyer itself. And, the AIs will tell you this themselves. I asked ChatGPT and Google Bard whether it's a good idea for me to have them draft a contract and then send it off to someone, send it off to the other party to the contract without even having a lawyer look at it. I asked ChatGPT and it told me, I am an AI language model and not a licensed attorney. While I can assist you in drafting a contract, it is important to note that I cannot provide legal advice or guarantee the legal enforceability of the document. So in the same vein, Google Bard told me, I would not recommend that you ask me to prepare a contract and then send it to the other party without a lawyer reviewing it. It goes on to say that it is important to have a lawyer review any contract before you sign it to make sure that it is fair and it protects your interests. So there it is, straight from the horse's mouth. But I know a lot of you are still tempted by the prospect of using ChatGPT and other text-based AIs to draft your contracts. And I know that some of you are out there trying it. And, it's obvious why it's tempting in the independent film context because budgets are so low and the cost of hourly legal services, tends to be unaffordable or tends to be very high relative to those indie film budgets. So it's understandable, but I'm going to tell you in this video that you shouldn't do it. Let's look at what ChatGPT and Bard can do right now in May of 2023 as far as drafting contracts is concerned, and the flaws that we see in their attempts to do that. And I'll use a very simple agreement as an example, like a simple talent agreement for an independent film, and see what they can do with that. But before we get started, if you appreciate the content in this video, then please like this video and subscribe to this channel so that I can keep providing this kind of educational content to enterprising young indie filmmakers like yourself. So let's look at the first issue, which is really that the AI can only do what it's prompted to do. It may be a basic observation, but an AI can only draft a contract according to the specifications that you give it. If you don't understand what the basic building blocks of a contract are, and you leave some of them out of the prompt or the text that you give to the AI, those building blocks might not make it into the contract, and then that might result in legal problems down the line. Let's look at an example here. Here I tell Google Bard, please draft an agreement with an actor in an independent film saying that they will be paid $206 per day. Now, if I were a non-lawyer and I just wanted something really basic, that's probably the kind of thing I'd ask an AI to do, right? And Bard does produce what I would call a passable, if kind of simplistic agreement. It says the actor will be paid $206 per day, and it has a provision for the length of time the actor will perform that leaves a blank for me to fill in. It's got a couple of other typical contract provisions that are important, like an entire agreement provision and a waiver provision. So far, so good. But Bard's draft leaves out at least three important things, which are provisions that I've talked about on this channel, and that a distributor is going to want you to have once it comes time for you to look for a distribution for your movie. In fact, distributors often require these provisions in the contracts that they have filmmakers sign. Specifically, I'm talking about an image and likeness provision, a no injunctive relief provision, and a work made for hire provision. To review what those are, the image and likeness provision says that you, the filmmaker, have the right to use the actor's image and likeness in any and all media and in perpetuity for the purposes of your film. The no injunctive relief clause says essentially that if the actor sues you for breach of contract and wins, the only relief the actor can get is damages, that is money. They can't get an order from the court saying the film can't be screened or distributed. Then there's the work made for hire provision, which says that the actor has no right to the intellectual property, that is mainly the copyright that's associated with the film. So if I went out and I tried to use this contract that Bard gave me, without having a lawyer look at it, I would be leaving out important language that might lead to problems for my film, and specifically with distribution in the future. Now, let's look at what ChatGPT says in response to the same prompt. It gives me a more detailed agreement. It has an intellectual property clause, which is essentially the work made for hire clause that I talked about a moment ago. But it doesn't have the image and likeness and the work for hire provisions. Now, of course, this problem can be solved if you're able to look at the contract and notice that it lacks some of the essential building blocks of a talent agreement. I can put a much more detailed prompt into the text box that I feed into the AI that includes the language that I'm looking for. So here, for instance, I tell ChatGPT, please draft an agreement with an actor in an independent film stating that 1, the actor will be paid $206 per day. 2, the actor cannot receive injunctive relief in the event of a breach of the contract. 3, the actor licenses the right to use their image, name, voice, and likeness in perpetuity and throughout the universe. And 4, the actor's contribution is a work made for hire. And ChatGPT gives me the language I need. It's got provisions for image and likeness, injunctive relief, and work made for hire, although I think those are still somewhat oversimplified versions of what I would use. But are non-lawyers really aware of all the provisions that a talent agreement in an indie film, really needs to have? If you're not a lawyer and somebody handed you the contracts that these AIs prepared that we've been looking at so far in this video, would you be able to see that they lacked some of the fundamentals that are necessary for an indie film talent agreement? I think that if you're just a filmmaker and not a lawyer, I don't think that's the kind of thing that you would like to be focusing on. Obviously, your preference would be to be making films. And this brings us to a related issue, which is that an AI is not necessarily aware of the legal implications of the terms you're using in the contract. It's sort of not aware of the legal backdrop against which the contract is being drafted. When you ask a lawyer to draft a contract, ideally they're not just going to take a term sheet that you give it and translate that into legalese and say, okay, here's your contract. They're going to think about the legal implications of the terms that you gave them, whether or not any of the terms that you gave them might not comply with the law, right? They're going to try to use their knowledge of the law to see whether the contract terms that you asked them to put into the agreement will pass muster if a court or a regulator or something like that ends up looking at them. Let's look at an example. So here I asked ChatGPT and Bard to give me a talent agreement saying that in a production to be shot in Los Angeles, the actor is going to be paid $10 per hour. So the AIs both do this, and they do at least a halfway decent job at preparing the contract. But what's the problem? The problem is that this contract wouldn't be enforceable because the rate of pay is below the minimum wage in LA, which is $15.96 right now in May of 2023, and it will go up to almost $17 in July of 2023. Now, interestingly enough, if you ask Bard what the minimum wage is in LA County, it will give you the right answer. It just can't connect the dots between that piece of knowledge and the problems that might come up if you tried to pay an actor a below minimum wage in your contract. If you're working with a lawyer, ideally they're going to raise this issue without you having to specifically flag it for them and say, hey, is this contract going to comply with the minimum wage and other employment regulations? They'll tell you, hey, I couldn't help but notice when I was drafting this contract for you that you're offering below the minimum wage, and that's going to create a legal problem for you if you try to go ahead with this production and use this contract. That's really a critical way that we add value as attorneys in an ideal world. So even if you did have an AI draft a contract like this, even if it's a simple contract like a talent agreement for an indie film, and I wouldn't recommend that you do that given the state of AI right now, you should at least run it by a lawyer to make sure that it complies with all the applicable laws and regulations. So let's talk about another issue, which is that you can only put so much information into the prompt or the text that you type into the chat box that you're giving the AI before it starts to get confused, right? Before it starts to get lost in all the information that you gave it and to start making errors. I did a long video recently about how to share profits from your film with your cast and crew members. Like I explained in that video, preparing a contract that does that isn't as simple as just saying this cast member is entitled to 5% of the profits or something of that nature, 5% of the profits from the film. You have to make clear how the profits are calculated, and that's going to involve definitions of terms like revenues and costs and so forth. In fact, a lot of agreements to share profits in the film industry use what's called a waterfall provision in the contract. And here's an example of that. That's a long clause showing who gets profits from the film first, who gets them second, and so on down the line. But if I try to put all that language into an AI prompt, it will be difficult to get the AI to understand me. So here I try to have Bard and ChatGPT reproduce a profit-sharing provision that I often use in agreements with people involved in indie films who are getting shares of the profits. As you can see, this is a pretty detailed definition, but it's also pretty typical of agreements that call for profit sharing in film. It starts out by defining adjusted gross receipts to mean basically all revenue received from the exhibition of the film, but not including any investments in the film, tax subsidies, and loans made to the production company. Then we deduct distribution fees, expenses, and taxes to get what are called gross collections, which are basically the profits from the film. We then distribute the gross collections according to a waterfall, which starts with any tax intermediary at the top and covers a few more people who will get profits, like people entitled to deferred pay, sales agents, and so on. Then finally, profits start getting distributed to investors and any cast or crew that we've given points or profit shares to. Bard tried to draft a profit-sharing provision according to these kind of complicated instructions that I gave it, but it ended up not including the waterfall provision at all, and it didn't include the definitions of adjusted gross receipts or gross collections in the draft. Instead, Bard says here that the cast and the crew members who are entitled to profits basically just get 50% of all revenue received from the film, which is very different from what I wanted and definitely not what you want to do. ChatGPT, as we see here, tries to reproduce this waterfall provision in the contract, but it forgets to put in the definition of adjusted gross receipts that I gave it. And so it talks about deductions from adjusted gross receipts, but that doesn't make sense unless you define what those are. So the AIs of today are not necessarily equipped to handle complicated legal language like this. And even the simple contracts, as we saw, that we draft are going to require a lawyer to take a look at them before they're sent out to the other party to the contract. To be fair, I think that part of the problem is that you can only communicate with these AIs by giving them this lengthy wall of text in a text box. Many humans would probably have difficulty parsing out text that was presented to them in that way too. But right now, that's the only way that we can communicate with the text-based AIs. And the fourth problem that I want to talk about with AI-drafted contracts is that it's difficult to revise them if you see an issue with them. So you can tell the AI to revise a contract that it just drafted for you. If it doesn't give you the precise language that you want, you can say, no, use this particular language that I'm giving you in this prompt right now. But even that doesn't necessarily work, and it's kind of clunky and unwieldy to keep having to give the AI more and more instructions in the text box until you get the draft agreement that you want. So a moment ago, we talked about how ChatGPT forgot to use the definition of adjusted gross receipts that I gave it. Here I tell ChatGPT to add that definition into the draft agreement it just gave me. But again, it does it in kind of an incoherent way, because it says that personnel share of net revenue refers to the net amount remaining after deducting the following from adjusted gross receipts. But then right afterwards, it defines what adjusted gross receipts are. Of course, we don't want to deduct adjusted gross receipts from adjusted gross receipts. That wouldn't make any sense. And then it goes down the waterfall list, but it doesn't provide any context as to why it's going down the waterfall list. I'm sure that I could keep giving ChatGPT prompts to correct its work until I get the document that I want. But I mean, again, is that something that I'm going to feel able to do if I'm not a lawyer, right? Even if I understand all the legal verbiage, am I going to be willing to keep putting more and more commands into the text box to have the AI revise the contract again and again, particularly if I'm not a lawyer and I'm bored by this kind of stuff and I want to be out there making movies? I think the answer to that is probably no. Also, the text-based AIs that are available to the general public right now, like ChatGPT and Google Bard, aren't able to just render all the terms you want within a Word document or edit documents that you've already prepared within your word processor. So the best you can do with a contract that an AI has drafted for you is copy the text from within the text window of what the AI has told you and then paste it into a Word document or paste it into whatever type of document you're using. And then if you have the AI make revisions, then you have to copy and paste more text and so on and on. I'm sure that the technology for this will exist someday, but of course it would be easier if the chatbot were integrated into the word processor itself. And then I could tell the AI something like, on page 5 of this Word document, revise the definition of adjusted gross receipts so that it reads as follows, and then give it some language. Or I could tell it to create a Word document that uses the following contract language. That would be a lot more convenient than all the copying and pasting. But even then, if I weren't a lawyer, the mere fact that I could have the chatbot revise a Word document instead of giving me a bunch of plain text wouldn't necessarily help my ability to understand the contract that the AI had prepared. And that's where lawyers come in and where I think they're going to continue to come in for the foreseeable future. So like the AIs themselves have told me, I definitely wouldn't recommend having a text-based AI prepare your contracts. But if you do that, I would definitely recommend having a lawyer take a look at them and possibly revise them, and probably a lot of revisions are going to be needed. I'm sure that this technology is going to advance at exponential speed in the future, and that eventually they're going to take the place of lawyers, these AIs, but that definitely has not happened yet. I hope you found this video helpful. One thing to remember, as I always say, is that this is not legal advice. If I were going to give you legal advice, I would need to understand your specific circumstances and your specific needs. And right now, I'm just a lawyer talking to you on the internet. So anyway, thanks for watching.